Okay, let me introduce Skye Cleary. Skye C. Cleary, PhD and MBA, that was news to me, interesting, is a philosopher and author of How to Be Authentic, Simone de Beauvoir, and the Quest for Fulfillment. That's the topic for today. Existentialism and the Authentic Life, Existentialism and Romantic Love, and co-editor of How to Live a Good Life. And I know because I read that book that it was co-authored with Dan Kaufman, who, Boron's in the audience. Boron and I went to grad school with him, and Massimo Pigliucci, who's also teaching at the same grad school, CUNY. Just adding that little sidebar information. Skye teaches now at Columbia University, previously at the City College of New York, alongside Lou, who was just here. Barnard College, the New York Public Library, and with incarcerated students. That's really interesting. I don't have the courage to do that. Good for you, Skye. She's also a thinking partner with Philosophy at Work, former editor-in-chief of the American Philosophical Association's blog, and a certified fellow with us, the American Philosophical Practitioners Association. Before philosophy, she was an international equity arbitrageur, management consultant, and officer in the Australian Army. These are fascinating things I didn't know about you. If I didn't have you here today, I might not have ever learned that. Well, in your introduction, I think you mentioned some of those things in your book. Her work has been published with the Wall Street Journal, the Paris Review, Aeon, the Times Literary Supplement, TED, Ed, Los Angeles Review of Books, The Independent, The Conversation, Business Insider, New Republic, and others. I would emphasize that this summary of her CV shows that she's doing important work in public philosophy, which is itself an important component of philosophical practice, which larger umbrella includes philosophical counseling. Very impressive, Skye. Congratulations on all your success in these different domains. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Skye Cleary to the APPA Book Clubs series. So Skye, tell us about yourself. While you've been on the APPA Agora, for some of our listeners, this will be new information. So please tell us how you came to philosophy. Well, tell us about yourself, how you came to philosophy first, and then maybe how you came to existentialism and Simone de Beauvoir.
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, all those things at the end sort of collide. I came to philosophy when I came to existentialism. Well, I did study a year of philosophy in my undergraduate degree in Australia. Hated it. Well, okay, that's a strong statement. But it just didn't catch. It was a very analytical introduction, which was fine, but I was just like, no, not for me. So I put it aside, maybe not quite 10 years later, did an MBA. And and this was still in Australia, in Sydney, and I was in an organizational behavior classroom, and the professor was doing her PhD, Anne-Marie Moody, in existential dynamics in the boardroom. And so she started talking about Beauvoir and Sartre. And I was like, wait, what is this? Why didn't they teach me this in my undergraduate degree? And so I was like, this is so interesting. And at the time, I was also having a lot of questions about relationships in particular, things like, tensions with boyfriends and how much of myself should I be expected to give up to be in a relationship, and how do I navigate career and love and family and all these different tensions. So this was all swirling around in my brain. And the question about that this professor was talking about, with this tension between freedom and responsibility and authenticity and bad faith, I was like, that sounds like, and I figured out pretty quickly that the existentialists didn't have the answers, but what they did have was a language and a framework to at least help me think through the problems and the challenges I was facing. And it was about that time that a book was published called Tête à Tête by Hazel Rowley. And that was specifically on the relationship between Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. And it was like a philosophical dual biography. I was like, wow, yeah, okay. These are the sorts of questions I'm dealing with. And I found like a lot of what they were talking about, like relevant to the challenges that I was facing, and helped me clear up a lot of things, bring me back to sort of almost first principles, like just thinking about, okay, okay, so for example, I'd very much been brought up with the narrative of the romantic narrative of, um, falling in love, finding the one, falling in love, getting married, having babies, and living happily ever after. And this was the point at which I was sort of starting to question that, because I was looking around me and a lot of relationships just weren't happy, or they had those things and weren't happy. And I'm like, is that the formula for a good life? And I just didn't know. And what I liked about what Beauvoir and Sartre were talking about was that they were pushing back on these social expectations. They were pushing back on this traditional narrative, and working on creating a relationship on their own terms, with philosophical kind of inspirations, I guess. And so I found that, kind of that, I mean, they wouldn't want to be considered role models, and I certainly don't consider them role models, but what I appreciated was them questioning traditional narratives and pushing back on what was expected of them, and that kind of opened my eyes to new possibilities. So, yeah, so that's pretty much how I came across A, philosophy, and B, existentialism, and how I started getting, very much caught up in, yeah, this narrative. And so, yeah, after my MBA, one of my professors was like, "Oh, you should do a PhD," and I was like, "Really?" I'd never thought of that before, but I'm like, "Okay." And I was so interested in the question, first of all, about love and relationships specifically. Like, can we choose to love? What's that equation look like? What, can we choose not to love? And it sort of, yeah, my whole philosophy world kind of took off from there.
Yeah, so it's not surprising that, what I said, oh, you're doing good work in public philosophy. What drew you into philosophy was the personal, practical aspects of it. Something that you don't get in your undergraduate courses if you're in a college or university where all the philosophers in the department are analytic philosophers, because analytic Anglo-American, philosophers kind of poo-poo continental philosophy altogether, even if they have to teach a course on it. They downplay it. So existentialism falls under that category. Continental philosophy is, in general, difficult for analytic philosophers because it's so not logical, it's more practical, and they want to be scientific mathematicians and about concepts and everything. But human beings need practical philosophy. So it's nice to know that that's what drew you into this. I just wanted to add that I went to at Boron, like I said, who's in the audience, and Dan Kaufman, your co-author, we all went to the CUNY Graduate Center. When we were there, it was totally analytic philosophy, like super, and even things like ethics and aesthetics and the history of philosophy were secondary to this language, logic, science, philosophy of mind, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I'm not surprised. Most people when I meet people at cocktail parties or whatever, and they hear philosopher, they either loved it or hated it in college. And if they hated it, it was because they had the experience like you did. All this logic chopping about concepts, what the hell is that? How's that meaningful? Yeah, so I'm not surprised that things about meaning captured your interest when you were a young person trying to figure out where to go in your life. All right, so
On that, sorry, and just one more thing that,
yeah,
I have found through, talk. This is just anecdotal, by the way, but just existentialism in particular seems to be a bit of a gateway philosophy
that's
for.
a good metaphor. Yeah.
Like, I know a lot of people who read Camus or Beauvoir or something, and they're like, "Oh, this is what philosophy is." Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is a good gateway drug for philosophy. Good idea. Good. I like that idea. That's a nice metaphor. All right, so you've written a few books about existentialism already before this one, right? This is the last book that you've come out with so far? Okay. So why this one after three other books about existentialism? What's the difference? This one's mostly about Simone de Beauvoir, but still.
Yeah. So still working through issues. No, I mean, I'm joking, but not really. I mean, I think I so well, after I wrote my the book Existentialism and Romantic Love, which was my first book, it was on five different philosophers, Kierkegaard, Stirner, Nietzsche, Sartre, and Beauvoir. And Beauvoir was definitely she was sort of the concluding chapter. She was the one that I resonated with most specifically, I think partly because she kind of talks more about ethics and situations, and she's very she was interested in living philosophy and kind of practical solutions. So I was already interested in Beauvoir, but okay, and then there was this a lot of I mean authenticity is has been and still is kind of a buzzword. And I would keep hearing it around places. And I'm like, what even is that? Like, what are we talking about? Is it just being yourself? And I'm like, really? Like, what? Like, for example, Brené Brown talks about it as, okay, don't quote me on this, but something about authenticity is the practice of letting go who you're supposed to be and embracing who you are. And I'm like, yes. But how do I know who I'm supposed, like who I am? Like, where do I even start with that question? Like, I need to know more. Like, yes, it sounds good. Yes, I want to know that. Yes, if authenticity is like the key to a meaningful or fulfilling or happy life, whatever it is. Okay, I need more information. So it was partly that. And frustration with sort of the narratives around like they just seem very superficial, like you do you, and I'm just like, well, I can't just always do me, like because I live in a world with other people. And I think this book kind of or this concept became particularly kind of resonant with me, especially after I had a child, a baby, and I was thinking a lot about how it was that how could I be authentic and how could I be me, whatever that meant, when I was being pulled so far away from myself by being the life support system for my baby. And so it was that tension of like feeling myself being dissolved into something else or for someone else.
Other care, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just like, well, what's left of me? How do I like where do I go from here? What is my whether it's I mean, I wasn't thinking about what is my identity, but really, well, where is this balance? And I think that's where it really came up to a boiling point, I guess, for me about uh yeah, so partly finding out, okay, well, this discussion about authenticity, is it, almost often it's discussed, I heard it being discussed about, introspecting and finding your inner self or your inner child. And I'm like, what is that? How do I know when I found it? How do I find it? And as if there's like this blueprint there that's waiting to be discovered. And so I was really frustrated with that. And I did know that Beauvoir said a bunch of things about authenticity. So I'm like, okay, let's go. I need to find out what she says to help me out and help me through these kinds of questions.
Great. Yeah. So I guess your intuition or maybe your memory from having written a book about her alongside a handful of other existentialists, there was more in what she has to say about authenticity than the others. Is she like the biggest spokesperson for authenticity among the list of names that you gave us from your first book?
Yeah, I mean,
What does
so
she say more about it? Is she clearer about it? Or she makes it
yeah,
salient?
yeah, I mean, so I mean, of course, Heidegger is sort of more the one that talks traditionally about authenticity, but I really struggle with Heidegger.
So do I.
And so I was reading a bit, and I'm just like this, okay. So I was not I mean, I've done some Heidegger, but I struggle to get into that a little bit, and ethical issues about Nazism and everything. So that was complicated. But I did. Sartre talks a little bit about authenticity, but mostly to say, I'm not authentic. I've never been authentic. I just sort of point the way for others. But Beauvoir is sort of more the one. I mean, it's not like she wrote a book about authenticity or anything, but she talks about um, living in authentically meaningful ways, and she talks about sort of the kind of the challenges, and especially in The Second Sex, it was, her, which she wrote in 1949, was very much about, well, men have been subject, women have been other, men have been the ones who have been able to go and live authentically meaningful lives that they create for themselves, and women were sort of left on the sidelines, defining themselves through men, but not for themselves. And so she's like,
So you being a woman, you could sort of make sense of this concept through her lens because it was very salient for her how authenticity was more challenging for the second sex. Yeah. Yeah. If I could put what you're saying into my own words.
And yeah, it's very much so The Second Sex was very much about women, but she also does talk about men and the implications for men, and that if we're sort of pushed into these social roles where women are meant to be the child care people, and men are meant to be the breadwinners, that kind of limits men's freedom as well to do as they choose, because they need to keep in line with what's traditionally expected of them. So what she really wanted was for everyone to have, an open future that they could make choices from. And so chipping away at these kind of rigid social expectations for what we're supposed to do, so we can choose from a wider range of options for ourselves.
Yeah. Just one little sort of footnote to one thing that you said about Heidegger and Nazism. I remember reading, I think it was in your introductory chapter, you made a good distinction where you said if a philosopher is doing like philosophy of mathematics, like Gottlob Frege or something, and he happens to be anti-Semite, that doesn't necessarily undermine his intuitions in philosophy of mathematics. But if somebody's doing philosophy of human nature, and then they have theories about human nature that are bigoted, etc., well, then that might undermine their credibility. So I just wanted to thank you for that brilliant little remark. I remember reading that in your, and I thought this is a very smart way of putting that point. But I could still understand people say, oh, that guy's a racist or whatever, so I don't care what his mathematical wisdom was, But yeah, it was a nice way to differentiate between that. And so you mentioned Heidegger was a Nazi, whatever. So yeah, I get that. All right. So my first question, my next question rather, is totally relevant to what you were saying of like, we've got all these different parts of ourselves. So just be yourself. What does that mean? So how would you, somebody who's written, I'm not putting you in the hot seat, but how would you distinguish or help others distinguish between authenticity as some kind of romanticism about self-creation on the one hand and the ordinary notion of just being yourself? Like, is there some differentiation that you could share with the audience who hasn't read your book? Some snippets? How does a person, like you said, you didn't know, what do you mean just be yourself? So how do you differentiate that?
Yeah. So I'll just specify that what I talk about when I mean authenticity is that this is sort of I don't know, this is like the punchline in many ways, but it's like authenticity from an existential perspective is a process of creating your essence. So existence precedes essence, so we're thrown into the world, and then how we create ourselves is the process of authenticity, which is a big adventure of kind of expressing our freedom to become who we choose. So in some ways, just being yourself, sure, that's part of it. But I mean, the question is, well, who is myself? And the existential view is that we're always growing and becoming and overcoming ourselves. So we might actually not be the same person today that we were yesterday. We might not want to be the same person because we've had new experiences, we've gained new wisdom. So we're always in this kind of dynamic process. And so there's a framework that the existentialists talk about, which I found really helpful in my, I guess, in practical ways. And that is that there are multiple dimensions of our being. So one dimension is being for ourselves. So that's, being an agent in the world, expressing my freedom, creating who I am. But we coexist with other people. We share the same human condition with other people. So other people are a fact of our existence. And so
Didn't Sartre call that hell?
hell is other people. Exactly. Yes. Hell is other people. Yeah. So, well, Beauvoir was like, well, other people aren't always hell. Like other people are pretty great too sometimes. But yeah,
I
so
like her emphasis, her positive spin on other people and the necessity of them in our happiness, which is not hell.
yeah, and I think this is also why I've been drawn to Beauvoir is that she does have like a lot more of an optimistic element to her thinking. And so yeah, there's being for myself or ourselves, being for others, which is just acknowledgement that there are other people in this world and they're important too, and they have their own subjectivities and their subjective experience. Okay, and so they're sort of separate individuals from me, but also we're interconnected. And so Beauvoir's, well, not just Beauvoir, Heidegger and others talk about this too, but the sort of overlap is being with others. And so Jean-Paul Sartre said that being with others is always in tension and it's always a power struggle and it always ends in sadomasochism because we're always trying to dominate the other person and control what they think of, control what they think of us. So this is that hell is other people based on sort of the Hegelian dialectic. Whereas Beauvoir is like, well, okay, so if we fall too far into being for ourselves, that's a very sort of narcissistic and selfish and self-centered way of being if we don't take into account that other people are here and we need to get along with them for social existence, but also being for others, being pulled too far in that direction, that's also part.
Yourself, yeah.
Yeah, and this is one of the things in Beauvoir's The Second Sex is that she's saying that women have always been expected to be for others, for their children, for their husbands, for men. And if you get pulled too far in that direction, it ends in slavery, if you're not choosing it. But if you do choose to be for others and at the expense of being for yourself, then she says that's a moral fault because you're sort of giving yourself up to the whims of other people and just becoming passive beings defined by others.
He says that's a choice, though, right? You have a choice.
Yeah, and that's one of the tensions in this. Like she's like, yeah, women have gone along with it, like they've agreed to it. And sure, there've been significant costs to doing that. But there's also significant costs to not
Disagreeing. Yeah.
So yeah, she's like, women have been complicit in their own subordination. And so I'm saying ideal. I don't mean ideal. I mean this being with others, this finding the balance between being for ourselves and being for others. Like this is always going to be a tension, but she says harmony is never a given. We always have to work towards that harmony, but harmony is possible. It may be fleeting. We may not, we may get along with someone one day, there may be tensions the next day, but so it's always a navigation between these dimensions of our being, but working towards that being with others, like that's sort of the sweet spot, I guess, that overlap.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Little anecdote. I remember when I was going through a divorce, I went for Gestalt psychotherapy because one of my best friends in graduate school went on to become a Gestalt psychotherapist. So when I needed therapy, I called her up and she hooked me up with somebody from the institute there. And when I finally realized, I remember having this insight, like, I've been living too much for others. I'm never going to do that again. Right. And my therapist said, it's going a little too far in the other direction. It's about balance, Rick. So that's my little personal anecdote for that. All right. So this is a practical philosophy. So what are some practical steps individuals can take to sort out that balance between their own desires and societal expectations? Any
Yeah, I mean, one of the
balance hacks?
yeah, it's recognize that it's a challenge. That's the first thing. But one of the, I guess, just based on what you were saying just before as well, one of the metaphors that Beauvoir uses that I think she actually got that from the Stoics, but she talks about how each of us are like stones in an arch, right? And so we're all interconnected, we're all supporting one another. And so we need to take care of ourselves. Otherwise, that part of the arch crumbles, but we also are interconnected to other stones in that arch, and we all hold together in this human society. So, but okay, so I think it is, navigating that tension between taking care of ourselves, but also acknowledging other people. And that's an ongoing reflection, right? It's, and, one of the, I guess, the things that's also coming to mind is, when I was talking about in the beginning, how one of the things that appealed to me about Beauvoir and Sartre's philosophies was that they were pushing back on societal expectations. And so being in relationships, I was thinking about, well, should I get married? If that's not necessarily a happy life and so many marriages are ending in divorce, maybe I shouldn't do it. And I mean, the thing is that, okay, so spoiler alert, I ended up getting married, I ended up having a baby. And so the question is, well, did I do that? Actually, was that actually an authentic choice for myself, or was I actually pushed into it by societal expectations for, tax reasons and because my friends were doing it and because my parents wanted it? I mean, I guess the real answer is I'm not entirely sure what it is, but what I do know is that I interrogated that decision. I interrogated it on my own. I interrogated it with my now husband. I thought a lot about what I want and why. And I think that's part of the process. And it would be, I guess, bad faith for me not to acknowledge that there are social expectations and that, what my parents want actually is part of what's meaningful to me. And thinking about, well, if we had children, how is that going to be? So there are lots of different factors that went into that. So I guess, but continual interrogation, it is exhausting and it takes a while, and of course, we're not going to do it constantly, but making space and making time for those questions to think about, okay, well, what am I actually wanting for myself? And not necessarily maybe what my heart desires, but more importantly, what are my intentions? What's my future? Where do I want to go with my life? For example, one boyfriend I was seeing, I was talking to him about doing a PhD, and he was like really mad about it because he's like, well, when are you going to have time for me? And I'm like, wow, okay, there's something wrong with this question or something wrong with his attitude. I'm like, well, should I be expected to give up something that is actually super exciting to me for this relationship? And so I had to make a choice. Okay, well, no, I'm sorry. If that's how it is, I'm going to have to say goodbye to that relationship because this is so important to how I want to shape my life. And then the guy I married, when I told him, he was like super excited for me. He's like, that's really cool. And so I'm like, oh, okay. So that those goals sort of align. And it's not like he wanted to do a PhD too, but he was willing to support me on my journey. And sorry, I'm getting off track now. So the point.
Really, in my opinion, what you're displaying is you're exemplifying the very virtue of authenticity by being so honest and humble and acknowledging the way. And Beauvoir makes a big deal about the reality of all the constraints and circumstances that are limiting factors that we have to realistically address. So your little narrative there, I think, was a perfect answer to the question. It's people can identify from a narrative and an example, and that's what you're giving. So that was not off the track at all.
Okay, well, just bring it back to one other thing I was thinking about. So that's good to hear. Thank you. Is that, having, and I guess we just exemplified that, which was having, like the gaze of the other, like interacting with people who challenge you and who you can test your thinking with and say, oh, is this off track? Or, well, I mean, this is a small example, but having that, not just having relationships where people are like, yeah, whatever you're doing is just great, and not really critically thinking and challenging you, but being honest and having that sort of intersubjective relationship where you trust other people and they can support your growth and challenge your thinking where it is needed. Say if I said something wrong and you're like, oh, actually that is off topic, like I would respect that. But yeah.
Two different models of friendship. In fact, Boron, again, in the audience, he's doing a lot of philosophical work on friendship right now. We've had many conversations about this, but this is simple and everybody knows this. But two different kinds of friends, one who tell you you're always right and the other guy is wrong, and the other one who's willing to say, I think in this case, you know what, you overstepped or whatever. And the wisdom to know when either of those two things is more appropriate because you're having a meltdown or something like that. So yeah, great stuff. A quote came to my mind while I was listening to you talk about the importance of examining and questioning. It doesn't mean you have the answers and everything, but Robert Nozick, and I think this came out of his book called The Examined Life, analytic philosopher par excellence. When he was responding to the complaint that Socrates' main quote, that the unexamined life is not worth living, which sounds elitist to some people who are not philosophers. He said something like, the examined life is at least your own.
I love that.
A version of authenticity, right?
Yeah. And of course, all of us get tied up with jobs and busyness and life and stuff. And so it does take a little bit of time to step back and reflect. And in fact, I think that's related to the myth of Sisyphus and how he's, struggling up that hill every day. But the important part for Albert Camus was that moment when he walks down the hill. He's like, what is he thinking? Is he like, that's the time of reflection. And I've also just put a quote in the chat, which is one of my favorite Beauvoir quotes, which is about this questioning and interrogating. Like, do not back away from this questioning, for beyond the distress that it will perhaps provoke within us, it will destroy some of our shackles and open us up to new truths. So I like to keep that in mind for a little time for when I think I'm too much on autopilot to like bring it back.
Nice. Thanks for putting that in the chat. I'm going to copy that later. All right. So I think this kind of what you just said about our busy lives leads into my next question. Maybe you already answered it in a way. So in your view, what's the biggest obstacle to living authentically in today's world? And today's world is changing rapidly by the minute with AI and everything else. Oh, my God. Obstacle to authenticity in this set of circumstances that Beauvoir said, you have to know your circumstances to know what the constraints are on your authenticity.
Yeah, exactly. This is a great question. I mean, the first thing that's coming to mind is lack of critical thinking. This slide into mindlessness, this slide into the black void that is our social media and our phones and various echo chambers and things like that. So my son is 15 now, so I'm very conscious of, his social media use and the messages that he's getting from TikTok or, whatever he's watching. So I think this, and I guess this goes back to my previous answer, like what we were just talking about with critical thinking, like really stepping back and questioning these I mean, there's so much misinformation, so much so many so much fake news still out there. There's fact checkers are no longer a thing at many social media companies, and so teaching our kids philosophy is like teaching them critical thinking to question what they're being told, to question what I'm telling them, questioning what's going on in the world. And so I'm seeing a lot of, in my different realms, I'm seeing a lot of people asking for to talk about critical thinking. And was religion the first social media from Mike? I mean,
Kind of similar, yeah.
like, I don't know. I'm hesitant to answer that, guys, but that sounds, yeah, possibly. Um, yeah, so I mean, I guess, and that's so that this is one that's at the forefront of my mind right now. But then there are all sorts of other things. Like one of the ones that the big challenges that I've had and I actually still see is, and that Beauvoir was specifically concerned with, was masculine and feminine nature, and that who's emotional, who's supposed to be rational, and who's meant, what roles are we meant to take on, and the various like I'm thinking about the proliferation of like sort of the trad-wife influences and Andrew Tate style misogyny, and like how women and men are supposed to be, this policing of who's feminine, who's masculine. I think that's still around. Yeah, so I'm not sure, does that answer the question? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
that's a quite comprehensive play. So
But it's a bit Rick, can I ask what you see as, can I put the question back to you? What?
well, things are changing so much that I think that there's a kind of, when all boats rise, when the ocean rise, I think that it's only going to get much more challenging for everybody with AI, because already, I mean, you're teaching still for a living, yeah, at Columbia. I don't know if at Columbia you're experiencing this, but Boron and I at Community College in CUNY, almost half of our students are using AI to write their essays and acting like they wrote it themselves. So I'm just worried about in the way that nobody remembers a phone number anymore because we all have speed dial. Everybody's going to start using AI. Add that to all the other things that you said about social media and all these other things. It's only going to get more challenging. And I'm worried about the most important thing I think that you said was for younger people to learn critical thinking. So I'm not sure, like with that atrophying muscle that used to remember phone numbers, if we're going to have AIs telling us everything, I'm worried about the next generation who's going to grow up using AI for everything, whether or not they'll be able to think for themselves at all.
Yeah, and in fact, yeah, critical thinking is so important.
This is greater than the problem of authenticity, but it's certainly going to undermine the probability that more people will become authentic.
Yeah, I mean, AI just it hallucinates so much. I don't know if it's just the way I'm using it, but there are so
No.
many just like things that aren't real. I guess I'm expecting it to be factual, which it is not at all. But did you see the article in the New York Times last week that professors are using it too to do grading
Oh,
and
yeah.
things?
At
So
my college, we have a center for electronic e-learning or whatever. It's like a teaching and learning center where one of the director of our media program has been offering these little webinars lately to teach us how to use AI to run 90% of our courses. I don't know.
I mean, it's here. It's a tool. I think we've just got to, yeah, learn how to use it well and in a way that supports learning and teaching and supports critical thinking and not let it just take over the grunt work of thinking. Or I mean, I say grunt work like it's a chore, but the exciting work of thinking and philosophizing.
Yeah, well, maybe the need for, the human in the loop, which is a new phrase in the AI literature, will just keep growing, and things like philosophy will become really publicly appreciated more. I don't know. We'll see. We're at a very interesting time. Ancient Chinese curse, may you be born in an interesting time, right? So here we are. All right. We only have a couple more minutes before we turn it over to Q&A, and I had a bunch of questions I'm going to just skip over. I don't want to skip over two. One that's interesting to me because although I've done a lot of work on meditation and stuff like that, and philosophical counseling, also I have a great philosophical interest. I've published a lot on free will. So existentialists generally believe in free will, right? So and there's been a lot of recent popularity with all these arguments against free will. And almost everything about authenticity is kind of freedom of the self, right? Becoming the kind of being that you want to be. So what's your thinking about the idea that there's no free will? Or a related question is that the systemic barriers to even whatever the practical range of our agency are so huge that it's as if we don't have any. Even if metaphysically we had free will, the constraints on us are so huge that it's relatively meaningless.
Mm-hmm. So to think about the barriers, I mean, I think Beauvoir's response would be that it would be bad faith not to take those barriers, like whether they're structural or systemic or physical. So it's bad faith not to acknowledge that they're there. And I think this is one of her biggest sort of criticisms against Jean-Paul Sartre, who in many ways talks more about radical freedom, not absolute freedom, but just he's more on that realm of the spectrum, whereas Beauvoir's like, well, it's understandable that, women have been the second sex when we've had, social structures built by men for men's benefit and that sort of thing. So we need to actually take this into account. And and in terms of free will, I mean, yeah, I guess my view is that, sorry, I just heard someone crash. Are you okay?
You want to go check?
Yeah, do you mind? I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, that's fine. While you're gone, I'll keep talking about free will. So my thinking, if I was asked the question that I was just asked Skye, I might surmise that an answer would be something like, oh, okay, good. We don't have to imagine what you would say. I was going to play Skye and try and answer my own question. Is everything okay back there?
I just heard a scream and a lot of glass shattering, but actually it's no injuries.
So free will, yeah.
Free will. So yeah, on one hand, I think it's going to be an empirical question. I think neuroscience is working that out, but I don't think that it would invalidate either way. I don't know that would invalidate the existential view because, I mean, think about the facticity versus transcendence is how I think about it. So there are facts of our lives, whether that's facts of being born in the first place, or facts of our genes, or facts that I was born in Australia, or facts of who is running the countries now. So there are facts in our environment, facts of who we are as people. So that's the facticity. But what's important from an existential view is what window of freedom do we have to make choices? And okay, even if it's like this small window of freedom, it's like, okay, so how do we become agents of our own lives in order to like grab that's the exciting bit. The exciting bit is certainly, fine, how we navigate the facts of our lives, but how we also overcome the facts of our lives, how we stretch ourselves into the future. That's the exhilarating and exciting bit of free will and of existentialism. And so I guess you could say, okay, maybe we are all completely determined, maybe, or maybe it's all just fate or something. But Beauvoir says there's no sadder virtue than resignation. So it's like, I mean, we don't know yet, but and maybe we are on autopilot, but I mean, I choose to believe, I want to believe that we do have some agency in our lives, that our existence matters, that I find it depressing that we're to think we have no freedom at all. So I'm choosing that. And the alternative is that we're just passive, we're apathetic about life, I think, that's almost like dying before we're dead if we're just going with the flow. So, seizing that agency, even if it is an illusion, let's make a leap of faith into that and see what science ends up telling us. But I need to think that I have some agency over my life to get out of bed in the morning.
Interesting mixture of words. I like the idea of existential faith. I think William James said the first act of free will that he engaged in was the choice to believe in free will. And he had been quite depressed because of determinism before he made that choice, and it turned his life around. So what I would say is we have some kind of proximal control agency, even if on the bigger picture, it's all somehow or another determined outside of our realm of proximal control. If we don't exercise our proximal control, even if it's determined that we won't, that makes a difference in the causal stream of our lives, right? So, I think we have a choice whether or not to believe in free will and whether or not we want to act as if we have it. And that makes a difference, even if it's determined. Yeah. All right. So there's a practical free will versus metaphysical. And yes, that's an empirical question. Do we have metaphysical free will? We're not going to answer that today. All right, one last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Is there anything especially relevant in either themes of your book or certain chapters for the folks who come here? Most of the people who come here, not all the people who come here, are philosophical counselors or otherwise philosophical practitioners. How can Beauvoir or something you said about her philosophy be useful or relevant to philosophical counseling?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I set up the book was that you could dip into chapters that are of interest to you. So, if you're interested in sort of thinking about learning more about the fundamentals of existentialism, there's a chapter on, I'm calling it existential infrastructure, one of the early chapters that talks about those sort of core ideas. Or if there are challenges around life with kids, there's like a chapter on growing up, and then there's a chapter on parenting and a chapter on romance and one on old age. So I guess I've carved it up thematically in order to think through those different challenges. But I guess the main takeaway is that authenticity is a creative process, and it's not about finding ourselves, which is what often what people talk about, but it's about creating ourselves, because we are always in progress. And the authenticity is in the choices that we make. And hey, often we don't know if they were authentically meaningful choices until after the fact, because we're making choices in spaces of a lot of ambiguity and a lot of unknowns. And sometimes we need to make these decisions without full information. And so there's a lot of anxiety around that, or what Kierkegaard calls the dizziness of freedom. But so learning to, I guess, recognize that, and it's really about living intentionally and reflectively, and trying to untangle when we're kind of falling into social expectations, like bad faith, and when we're kind of, I was going to say lying to ourselves, but I hate that term, but when we're kind of, we're appealing to, maybe we're not overlooking certain aspects for convenience. So I think that's the main thing. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, I would add that there's something about the idea of authenticity. Well, authenticity seems to be the main overarching thing that glues all these other chapters together in your book, which makes sense because existentialism is all about making yourself, rather than having society make you mindlessly, etc. So, but like almost anybody who comes into philosophical counseling, except those who just come in because they just want to debate with philosophers, is someone coming in with practical interests, like the kind that drove you into existentialism. And so I think that like the kind of work that your book talks about is automatically intuitively relevant to philosophical counselors, particularly if they have a client that's coming in with any one of those issues that you have a theme on. It might help them get like some insights on how to apply this way of thinking to a particular client. So I'll just add that to what you said. I think it's a good mesh. I would encourage your book to anybody, even independently of philosophical counseling. It's really very intuitive and well written, and I really enjoy reading it.
I really appreciate that.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Q&A from the audience. If anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment, Boron. Okay, good.
Hi, Skye. I love so many things that you're saying. And one thing that I want to tell you is that I had a reverse kind of thing because I was educated in continental tradition and switched to the other side. But one thing that I'll definitely agree with you is they are asking the good questions, those existentialists. Those are the kind of questions that we would all like answers to. So I love it. The thing that I want to offer is a challenge for your views as far as authenticity is concerned. I'm like you. I don't really know who I am. It's very difficult to say who I am. And I think the reasons why it's so difficult to say who I am is that it's in part, I don't know, genetic, my biological needs. My biological needs, by the way, I was so happy that you had a kid like you, although you had the dilemmas whether you should. I think that there is a biological urge to have kids, to have offspring. And it's very difficult to get rid of. Your parents felt the same. So we have to figure out, like, what exactly do I lose and solve that dilemma. But I'm so glad that I had two sons and they are probably the most important thing in my life, so close to them. And part of who I am, part of myself is relational. So opposite of Sartre, I think that they are the best thing in my life. So I'm so glad that you had that. But here's the problem as far as who I am. So it could be biological need, but it's also the kinds of experiences we had. If I had unhappy experiences with my parents, that might really cause me not to have a desire to have kids. If that was something that was frustrated. So in order to know who I am, we have to know a lot of science. We have to know about like psychology, in what sense that has causal effect on us. But here's the problem: how does that relate to authenticity? Let's say, who knows what the reasons are? Let's say that I think about myself. I'm lazy. That's who I am. So I have a dilemma. Should I be authentic and simply act upon my urge to be lazy or not? So the end result might be what Rick was saying. Lots of our students cheat by using AI. And the thinking process is, I'm lazy, I don't have time, I don't know whether I can handle this. There are so many things, but I don't want to study for this. Let me use this. That's one way how you can be. Think of yourself, I'm lazy, and do something that is bad. You don't want to do that. I don't even want to go like into that like really, really bad direction. If you think about yourself, I have this urge to kill. so I want to be a mass murderer. In order to be authentic, let me create myself as a mass murderer. As I say, I don't even want to go there, but a little bit of hope is, well, in order to make sense of what you're saying, and that's authenticity, it has to have a lot with the kind of emotions that we have towards others. Do we care about them? To what extent do we care? If I hear that glass shattering, should I run? Okay, if it's my son is in danger, of course you should. And we all understand, like if we are on the same frequency, if we are authentic in the same way. Emotions plus that balance, it has to have some kind of rational solution that will help us to go authentic without just creating anything that is there. It has to be balanced by emotions and reason. That's it.
Mhm.
Boran, is that a question? Can you
Yes,
summarize
that's the question. Is because the problem with authenticity is like that you have you can be authentic and it can go in the wrong direction, and you can also create it. I assume both of us, so all of us, don't want to go there. How do we avoid that? Is the question.
How do we avoid the bad authenticity? Sorry, is that what you're saying?
Right.
Yeah, like was
The
Heidegger
authenticity,
being
undesired
authentic?
authenticity.
Was
Mhm.
Heidegger being authentic when he re-embraced his earlier Nazism?
Yeah. Well, Beauvoir said you can't be an authentic Nazi because it's denying the subjectivity of other people.
Right.
And because intersubjectivity is so core to her view of authenticity, which is one of the reasons I like her. I'm like, yeah, okay, she wrote The Ethics of Ambiguity. So she's trying to create this ethics based on, we share the human condition, we coexist. So, and this is a really fundamental question. Of course, religion provides some answers. Yes, be good. What's that thing? Good. Love thy neighbor kind of thing. But if you're atheist, like how do you, and you go into the humanism kind of realm. So it's interesting. In fact, I teach a class called The Authentic Leader at Columbia. And one of the discussions we had was about Batman and the Joker, in the Dark Knight is kind of the specific one I used. And it's like, well, is the Joker authentic? And it's like, well, and this unfolded a discussion about, well, is it just being yourself and following your emotions and returning to your childlike sort of, impulses? And, even Kierkegaard and Nietzsche talked about this kind of thing, is that's a very immature existence, just to be, it's very childlike. It's, it's like a child saying, oh, I want this, and having a tantrum if they don't get it. Fine, I'm distilling it down, but it's like, even Kierkegaard said, in order to live a more authentic life, we need to make that leap to the higher ethical, or, he went to the religious realm, but we need to make a leap and acknowledge this, that we are social people and that we do live with others, and to live in a society, there are certain compromises that we do need to make. Now, and a quick example, Kierkegaard talked about traffic rules. Like there are these rules, road rules, like that, yes, we've got to drive on, well, here it's the right side of the road, right? And does that limit your freedom or expand it? And it was like, well, it limits it in some ways, but in fact, it frees everyone up to be able to drive efficiently and much more safely to certain destinations. So that sort of thing is acknowledging, that's sort of a concrete manifestation of this intersubjectivity, and without religion, and acknowledging how we do owe something to other people. And we don't drive on, we could drive on the sidewalks, but there are consequences to that. So what else? Yeah, but I think I think you're right, Baran, about, it's the emotional and the rational. And I don't think authenticity is, I think it's both. in Nietzsche talks about how, we need both. It's the Apollonian and the Dionysian. It's like working with the two in concert and mastering our passions, but also enjoying our passions. And it's this constant negotiation between ourselves and, through our relationships with other people. So that's, I'm going to stop talking there.
I would add, in support of what you said, that without constraints, there are fewer affordances that are accessible to us. So this driving example is a really good way of making that clear. Yeah, you can't drive freely through intersections if there are no rules like the green light, etc. So yeah, and those are constraints, but they afford the possibility of flying through intersections safely because you've got the green light. But just a little follow-up pushback. Isn't it that, here's a criticism. Tacitly, the response is sort of smuggling in essentialisms about human nature as social rational beings. So maybe they're not the specific essentialisms of maleness and femaleness and all that, those kinds of essentialism, existence versus essence. But if we're rational, social, emotional, moral beings in general, and the sociopath is somehow or another deficient, then there are some essentials. There are some essences that are built in with the existence, maybe.
So, sorry, you're saying that like a sociopath who doesn't acknowledge their connection to other people doesn't fit that mold.
Yeah, here's the counter argument to the existence precedes essence, and there are no essences, and we create our essences through our choices. Well, when we create the wrong ones, we all suffer and everybody suffers. There's a counter argument that says, no, there are some essences. It's just not as many as we used to think. We're rational, social, emotional, moral beings, and we flourish under certain conditions. Like plants, they're the kinds of beings that need water and nutrients and minerals and sunlight and certain temperatures, and they have that nature. We have certain elements of our nature. There's species-specific characteristics that define us. And if we go against them, we suffer and we don't flourish. So this is a counter argument.
My instinct is that the existential answer would be that, well, how do we define essences versus facts? So if psychopathology is, or if psychosis, whatever, is it a genetic thing? Is it like, I don't know. I'm thinking of that. There was some study that said, or some author that said, oh, they have the psychopath gene, but they didn't become a psychopath. They became
This was a psychologist himself who has the gene. Yeah.
Yeah, and he became someone who, I guess, researches and
not a psychopath. Yeah, because he has the choice, and yeah.
So I guess that's where I'm thinking, like, how do we, like, I think this is a good question, how do we untangle facts from essences and stuff? Is it?
Yeah, exactly. So that's good. I'm glad you put it back into that lens. It puts it back into Beauvoir's the facts, which in the free will literature, that there's the luck argument against free will is that there's constitutive luck, which is all those kinds of facts. You were born as a female in a certain place at a certain time with economics and political, everything. Those things you can't, they're constitutive of who you are, right? But then there's, what do they call, contingent facts, like the weather that day, your mother had a car accident, this and that, right? So all of those things might undermine, those are tremendous constraints on us. But the authenticity and the freedom, the burden of choice, all those things remain. So I'm just wondering, it sounds like you could answer my objection just by saying, no, there's room for acknowledging all those kinds of constraints, and they still don't require you to identify with essences that come along with them in some way, shape, or form. You still have the freedom to recreate yourself, to transcend, as you put it earlier.
Yeah, and it goes back to what Boran was saying as well, like the environment that you're in. And that psychologist was, I think that their explanation was that, oh, they grew up in a very loving environment where that sort of gene didn't sort of take hold of. Sorry, it's been a while since I've read this, so please forgive me if I've gotten it wrong. But
No, that's correct. I remember that.
But let me make explicit something that might not be clearly seen because it's in the background. What we're talking about is a threat to the importance of the concept of authenticity. If such constraints are so important, then I can be authentic if I go along with what I truly desire. If I have to respect those constraints, am I really being authentic? Is what I'm asking.
so when you say more about respecting constraints, which constraints are you respecting?
Okay, so let's say that I have the nature of the Joker, and I want to be bad. All right. And there are certain constraints, and those constraints are, man, you can't kill other people. That's bad. So let's say that I realize that, like that scientist, oh, I can't be bad. So I change my behavior. Am I being authentic or am I being rational?
Mhm. Yeah, this was actually Carl Jaspers that talked about this, and he's like, his answer is, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, this is the self-other thing in my Gestalt therapy moment where I was like, I'll never care about what other people think. It's like, no, don't do that. That's going too far in the other direction. I would say, what an existentialist could say is every individual has the freedom to make that choice, to be the Joker or not. And we all have the constraints and consequences. Part of realism. You choose a certain path and you'll make your bed and you'll sleep in it. That's all. There's no algorithms that answer these questions. That's part of the idea of existentialism, which you said in the book. It's kind of an ongoing, endless challenge. Authenticity.
Yeah,
All right. We have a couple of other. You respond, and then we'll go to Ibrahim and then Alexander. Their hands have been up for a while.
Hi, good afternoon.
One
moment, Ibrahim. I want Skye to respond.
Okay, now I've just forgotten what I was going to say.
Okay.
Sorry, let me think about what I was trying to remember, but we'll go on to the other question. We can come back to it. Yeah,
okay.
Thanks.
Ibrahim Özdemir, it was so good to see you. Are you coming to us today from Turkey or are you somewhere else?
Yes, I am from Istanbul. This is midnight here. It is midnight.
Well, thank you for
Oh boy. Well, thank you for staying up late for this.
Because I follow Skye very well on the social media. She's very active. I'm glad to listen to her. But I think, Skye, Viktor Frank can help us about authenticity, agency, because he was a psychiatrist and he was in concentration camp, and he was a witness and also a doctor to many helpless people in the very horrible situations. And at the bottom line, he said, we are agents. We have to, we can't decide for ourselves. We have something which make us responsible. So I think I think he was visionary, but because as you talk about how you come to the philosophy and have a PhD and existential philosophy, he just talked in 60s, in 50s about the existential vacuum, He said we have to ask, about the meaning of life. But my question is that, is there any differences in finding meaning in the life or creating meaning? Finding meaning and creating meaning. And the second thing, in existentialism, as I'm also an environmentalist, I'm teaching ecofeminism. And then, the existential dilemma, I think, is about being for yourself and being for others. But what about being for non-human beings? Being for non-human beings. And, Plumwood and also Karen, Warren, they have a, excellent, views. They just, expanded the feminist discourse to include all other things and also to remind us agency. Again, when we talk about climate change and climate crisis, the intergovernmental panel on climate crisis, they concluded with their report worldwide. They say human beings, they are responsible, they are agents for the climate, many of climate crisis, more than 70% of climate crisis, the agent is human being. And I think we have to accept this, because otherwise we cannot solve these problems. As Rick said, even for practical reason, we have to, or to save the history of philosophy, all the metaphysics. There's something, although it is little, but what makes us human, make us responsible. I think it is that we have a limited agency. And I am also glad what you said about the critical thinking, because here in my university in Istanbul, I have been teaching also critical thinking for more than 7 years for all students. And there's a big interest, in my here in philosophical counseling or practicing. Many people come, they ask about, they have their major questions there about the meaning of life. As I think Viktor Frankl is right, he said we cannot escape asking these questions, which makes us human, Therefore, I think this is why there is a big interest in philosophical counseling or in philosophy, and also, as you said very well, in existential philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Yeah, so thank you for bringing up Viktor Frankl. I mean, I've read some of his work, but I haven't done a lot of research on it. But yeah, I'm so happy you brought up the non-humans aspect. I think that's it certainly wasn't on Beauvoir and Sartre's radar, but it is certainly on mine. And I think that finding that harmony, and I and I haven't researched or written on this, but I want to think that they fit into this similar framework, being for ourselves versus being for non-human others. And it's like freedom is meaningless without responsibility and without acknowledgement from an existential perspective.
Definitely.
Yeah, so Ibrahim, thank you. Yeah, that responsibility, not just to people, but more broadly. And the finding versus creating meaning. Yeah, this is a great question. And I mean, my view and the existential view is that, we're thrown into the world. We're here without a guidebook, or the guidebooks that are here, like the Bible and Quran and stuff, are unreliable, and not everybody accepts that those are the guidebooks, and they're questionable in themselves. And so here we are, where and the big question is, well, what do we do about that? Why are we here? Why? It's like, it's this insane question. And this is where you get sort of the existentialism versus nihilism kind of split. Nihilism is, well, there is no meaning, nothing matters. Whereas the existential view is that, well, yes, there is no meaning. Therefore, to live well, let's create it ourselves. I said find. Let's figure out, create what's meaningful for us. And, I mean, find in the sense that, go and explore and figure it out for ourselves. And that is a creative process, that adventure, that sort of discovery, disclosure, this like seeing what's available. So I think we need to shift the focus from finding meaning to creating meaning, and same with the same is with romantic relationships. It's not like there's one soulmate out there that we've got to find. It's the existential view is like, let's create relationships. And sure, there are facts like, are we attracted to the person? Are there whatever the pheromones or something? Is there some kind of biological, environmental thing? Okay, well, yeah, but we're not just animals like running. Well, we are animals, but we're not just animals. We are humans who can seem to make active choices and enter into long-term relationships with people. And so creating that relationship is sort of the rational side of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Rumi also would agree with you. Rumi says we have to reborn every day. Every morning we have to reborn.
Yes, yeah, we have to, get out of bed and reaffirm our existence every day. That's a beautiful way to say that, Ibrahim. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And Abraham, I'm sorry, I forgot to spotlight you. So I'm spotlighting you for a moment, and I'm going to just respond. I'm going to suggest, sorry, I'm bad host with the spotlighting. I had Boron up there and you not the whole time. But while I am answering still the thread that you raised, I'll leave you spotlighted. What the thought that came to me is a friend of mine who's a philosopher and a cognitive scientist named John Vervaeke. He says that the question about the meaning of life is an ill-formed, like grammatically ill-formed question. It's about, there's meaning in life. And that's what the existentialists say. We find it by creating it. It's not already pre-existing. There's no essence. It's not out there. But I would add, even if there was, like we breed certain animals and we bring them into existence with a purpose, right? And we create AIs with a purpose and all sorts of things like that. So even if we were created with a purpose, right, we have the power to say no to that. It's like being created as a slave or, in the future, cyborg AI military machine that's a killer might choose to say, to hell with that programming. I want to be free and I want to live a different kind of life, right? So this is kind of like with the transgenderism and all that, like freedom of self. What kind of self do you want to be? Even if there is meaning of life, right? If we're all in some kind of simulation or God made us to play certain roles, we still have the freedom to say no. That's my long-winded answer. Thank you. Really good question, Ibrahim. All right. So Alexander, let's get you up here and unmute yourself and please speak.
Hello. So, my question is
Tell us
similar to
where are you calling from?
from Serbia.
Serbia. I just wanted Skye to know that we've got an international audience here.
Wow,
Yeah.
thanks for joining, Alexander.
Thank you on the great speech. So my question is similar to Rick's. I want to contribute something to that authenticity paradox that we have here. So, my question is like, what is authenticity and where we can find it? So, on first glance, we have authenticity in external world and or inside us. We know that the authenticity cannot be in external world because there is some social rules enforced by our parents, our education, etc. So we naturally turns toward our inside world, our emotions, instincts, drives, gut feelings, etc. But if we consider that our emotions are just like our genetic heritage, like there are some ancestor but behavioral patterns that just work. If we have seen, if we saw emotions just like that, there isn't so much authenticity in them, and they're very similar to essences, like they're very similar to formal causes. So where we can find that authenticity?
Yeah, great question.
Very good.
So I'm thinking that, I mean, first of all, I want to say that authenticity, the way I'm conceiving of it, it's like it's not a thing as such, but it's like what I talk about, the way I usually phrase it in the book is like authentically meaningful actions. So it's like we make a choice. Okay, so I don't know, I'm trying to think of a basic choice. Yeah, okay, let's just say I choose to have a relation or enter into a relationship with someone. So I choose to go out on a date. I choose to hold their hand, So these are the actions. Now, what's the meaning behind those actions? Am I doing those things because of a social script, because it's what I think I'm expected to do, because I'm being pressured into it, because that's what you do like in life? Okay, so that would be, I would say, not authentically meaningful actions. But if then what makes those actions authentic is if I'm like thinking about this, I'm like, oh, I do like this person. I want a relationship with them. I am going to engage with them in authentically meaningful ways that will promote a relationship that flourishes. Now, of course, it's not just up to me, it's also up to this other person. Are they, if they're just going with the script, like also that we're not going to have an authentically meaningful relationship, right? It's where authentically meaningful relationships are where both people are acting in ways that are, I guess, and coming back to the definition of authenticity, where we're both creating our essences in ways that are meaningful to us. And, it doesn't mean we give up everything for one another, but it means we have our own lives, but we also do projects together. Projects, I mean, like maybe getting a home together, maybe having kids together, maybe, eating dinner together every night. So it's those actions, that's where the authenticity is. And it's not to anyone else, they won't know if we're behaving ethically or not. Only I can know if
And
I'm.
sometimes we don't know.
Exactly. Sometimes like, oh, I did this. Like, why was that? Was that authentically meaningful for me? And then I'm like, oh, it wasn't. Uh-oh, I was acting without thinking or without really maybe understanding what I was doing, or I was in a rush or something. So I think this is where critical thinking comes in again to authenticity. So yeah, does that make sense, Alexander? So.
Yeah. Great
Yes,
question.
actually, my answer is kind of similar. Yeah, but because like authenticity is in our personal story, in our narrative, in our project, to say certain. So my answer to that question is very similar. So thank you very much.
Oh, no, thank you, Alexander. I'm so happy to hear that.
All right. We have Patricia Murphy. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, Patricia.
Hi. I'm just, my mind is just going boom, 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 boom. And I wish we had another hour and a half. And I'm having very strong feelings and reactions to the whole conversation. But one thing I really wanted to underscore is I especially think of de Beauvoir as being the teacher of authenticity by showing inauthenticity. And I guess the work of hers that I teach the most is in a course on death I teach. And I teach her A Very Easy Death, which is the true account of her own mother's death in the hospital. And it's just enormously interesting, the ways in which she shows throughout the text the ways people get it wrong, the ways people impose their own interpretations of meanings on events for others. And I just, I didn't think enough was being said about, we do have a license. Our freedom gives us license to decide the meaning of events, but it also requires us to decide the meaning of events. And we can choose not to, and events will remain without meaning if we choose to do so, So I just had a lot of associations there. And that's all I really want to say.
Right. I appreciate that. And I'm so glad you raised that point about inauthenticity and, so much
Yes, I really just see her as presenting us time and time and time again instances of what that is. And we're left to kind of, draw the conclusion about what authenticity is. But I mean, I don't think it can really be described positively.
Interesting. So this is an alphatic approach to understanding authenticity as opposed to a cataphatic one. Positive or negative language. Yeah. Examples and what they're not. That often helps us figure things out in ways that trying to describe or define something, which is what philosophers love, just doesn't work sometimes.
And in so many stages in at least the text I like to teach, we see the inauthenticity of the medical community and the inauthenticity of her own mother's perception of her life, and the inauthenticity that Simone de Beauvoir goes on to associate with. One of the speakers in the book talks about, she was of an age to die, and the naturalness of death. And those are both interpretations that she rails against, So I think of it more in that negative interpretive way.
No, that's a great way to look at it. And so much of, and interesting, you would know this, but just for everybody else, it's like her book, When Things of the Spirit Come First, is basically 5 short stories of women in bad faith, or in bad faith, in authenticity, interchangeably, for Beauvoir. But yeah, and it didn't get published when she first wrote it because people were like, it's too depressing. But yeah, it got published later. But yeah, there's so much in there of Beauvoir saying, oh, this is, and I think
not the way to go. And sometimes I think of it as like, how we think of Plato's method of teaching, I sometimes call subtractive. We learn what things are not, right? Well, in many respects, that's what I think she often does, is show us the wrong ways.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I love that. Thanks for pointing that out, Patricia. It's a fantastic point.
One of the things that you said, Patricia, was that we even choose not to interpret. But sometimes it's tacit and it's not conscious because we ignore a choice option when it presents itself to us. And this made me think about William James, that short piece of his, The Will to Believe. Well, it's 10 pages, it's not that short, but where he says, okay, so evidentialists like Descartes said that, I like to make the contrast. Things that are clearly and distinctly true, we have to believe. Things that are clearly and distinctly false, we can't believe. But things that are neither clear nor distinct, we have freedom of the will with respect to whether or not to give our assent to them or not. And we should withhold judgment because we just don't know. And when we make a decision, it's an error. We shouldn't do that. That's where human error is. It all lies in that gray zone. William James says, no, that's the zone of live options, possibilities. If they're really important and they're the kind of thing where if you don't consciously choose, you're tacitly choosing. Like if you pass by a beggar on the street and you're so busy that you don't even think, should I slow down to give them something? You've chosen not to give them something. Right? So on some level, tacit choosing, that zone defines so much of our lives, that zone. And we don't consciously choose. So that this thing about what Skye said earlier, how do you be authentic? You just pay attention and you ask questions and you examine. That's Nozick's remark. At least the examined life is your own. And the more that you examine, the more your life is your own, the more those semi-conscious, tacit, automaticity-based non-choices, which could be choices, come into your salience landscape, and you have more freedom the more you pay attention. That's what I would say.
Beautifully said, right?
Plugging awareness, attention. Mindfulness is the remedy to mindlessness. That's Rick Petty's main mantra.
Yeah, no, existentialists totally support that. Like, no choice is still a choice.
Yeah. All right, look, we're coming on the last minute right now, so we like to always give the speaker the last option to say anything. Where can people reach you? Are you plugging any work that you're on, or whatever you want to say? Anything you forgot to say? The floor is yours in closing.
Okay, so you can find my book, How to Be Authentic. That would be great to support or share. And I've got this Beauvoir quote in the chat ready. The conversion by which we attain true wisdom is never finished. It has to be made ceaselessly. It demands constant effort. A restless spirit is the ransom for our development. And it's hard to adopt than lies, but it cannot but bring happiness. So what I want to say with this is that authenticity is hard, it's challenging, as we all know, but one of the side effects can be happiness. Not necessarily, but it can be. And just one other thing that I wanted to tell is that I was last week running around Central Park. I'm based in New York, running around Central Park with a person who had a blind person, 2 glass eyes. And the way you run with a blind person is you each hold the end of a short rope. And I was thinking, this is an amazing metaphor for being for ourselves versus being for others. You know, here I am, you know, we're both out running. We want to be healthy and I want to feel good by doing something with a blind person, and she's motivating me. I struggle. She was 75. I struggled to keep up with her, but I needed her for motivation. She needed me so she didn't trip over or fall into something. And so this tether between us was like this being with others, and we had to actually keep it tense in order to be in harmony. So I want to say that a contrast such. Sometimes that tension can be the way to harmony. So thank you.
Wonderful. I love that story and the quote that you just read. I just want to say one more thing. Somebody mentioned Taoism or Buddhism. I do a lot of Buddhist philosophy, and so do a number of people who come here. I think everything that we heard today is consistent with Buddhism. Interestingly, because the Buddhists think that the idea that the self has its own nature is an illusion, if not the primary ignorance. So there's an interesting connection that became salient for me between existentialism and Buddhism today. I'm sure scholars would dispute a lot of that, but I just wanted to add that. But more importantly, thank you, Skye, for giving us your time today. And it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for coming back onto one of these APPA things.
Oh, thank you so much, Rick. Thanks for your great questions to Rick and to everybody else. This was really fun. And yeah, I wish you well for the rest of your Sunday or Monday mornings for some of you.
Yeah, some of you are here. It's early Monday. Thank you all for coming. Wonderful. All right, folks. The recording, when it's ready, Lou will let us all know.
Okay. And actually, I've just put my email in the chat in case anyone's interested in it, wants to follow up on any.
SkyeCN@me.com. So for those of you who can't see the chat easily, if you're on a phone or something like that. All right, folks. Well, you could always contact me and I'll put you in touch with her.
Sounds good.
Thank you, folks. Take care.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.